Child and Guardian by Michael B. Tager. The moment Child's head touched the pillow, the Guardian awoke. And when gentle snores reached her ears, she stood and moved about, waking herself thoroughly. She paid a long glance to the still forms of Child's other silent watchmen, the brown, soft form of the monkey with cheap-looking cymbals attached to its hands, and the smiling form of a plush bear next to each other above Child's head. The Guardian regarded them thoughtfully while it washed itself with a rough tongue. Alert for any noise, the Guardian padded with delicate care over every inch of the silent room. She ignored the howling of the wind outside and the normal sounds of the house, the ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs, and the hum of electricity. The house was old and always made some kind of noise, but she would be damned if through her carelessness or inattentiveness Child was harmed. The ancient, creaky hardwood floors made no sounds, no groans when she set foot ever so carefully on the scarred and scratched boards. She moved so slowly that the air was barely disturbed, and no wisps of dust ever lifted more than a scarce inch from the ground. When she reached the threshold of Child's room and made to enter the long, densely shadowed hallway, she paused and sniffed the air, alert for any hint of danger in the musty, dank-smelling corridor. After long moments of flared nostrils, the Guardian lifted one paw beyond the doorway. She sighed internally for a long moment as she scanned. She glared with suspicion at the veiled window, able to detect the bright glow of the harvest moon just through the gauzy curtains. She thought to herself that of all nights, tonight might just bring the danger she expected. After staring long and hard at the innocuous-seeming aperture, she decidedly dismissed it from her mind, readying herself for what lay beyond. She continued, inspecting each segment and every shadow. She thrust her snout into each shadow and tracked each possible movement, freezing whenever something that did not seem to belong intruded. When a tiny spider scuttled along one of the long grains in the floor, the Guardian lowered her head to the floor and tracked the long-legged creature with huge, soulful eyes. Motionless, save for her pupils, the Guardian waited until the spider moved closer, and with a snap ended the life of the hapless arachnid. Wincing at the bitter taste and the hard crunching in her mouth, she moved on. A cobweb wafted from the ceiling, struck down by a sudden breeze. Suspicious, the Guardian followed it, and when it lay motionless on the floor, pounced on it with all 4 feet, tearing it to shreds silently and viciously, the strands becoming tangled in her velvety, soft brown hair. As she savaged it, she looked down the hall and saw the window next to the stairs, the mirror to the one by the Child's room. What looked like a long skeletal hand reached up to enter the open window, and the Guardian, disdaining subtlety for speed, flashed down the wooden floor and jumped with all of her might at the window, slamming it shut on the slender limb, attempting to enter the house. There was a snap and a clatter as the branch fell lifeless to the ground. Victorious, the Guardian allowed her heart to settle from its rapid beating in her chest and dropped her body to the floor. Nose to the ground, she inspected the fallen, unmoving object. She felt a surge of shame when the image of the severed tree branch, apparently thrust into the window by the gale outside, became clear to her. She sat on her haunches and wailed silently, when she heard a noise coming from downstairs. She shoved down her embarrassment and firmed her resolve, moving her long, graceful legs down the padded wooden steps with no sound. She rounded the landing and ignored the window above her, moonlight streaming through the blue curtains. She could hear further movement close by, through the parlor and in the kitchen by the back door. She plodded down the last step and dropped her belly to the ground, inching forward slowly. She ignored the pricks and slices of the jagged wood so close to her body and lifted her small, delicate ears to discern what she could. When she reached the swinging door, she became perfectly still and lay in the shadow of the door. Her dark hair and deep pools of eyes blended perfectly in with the shadows. She trained her eyes on the white kitchen door and listened for the sounds from within. She could hear muttered speaking, a rough voice intoned like gravel crushed through a vice, and a high-pitched twittering response. The guardian waited for long moments. Nothing, however, came through the door. The guardian closed her eyes and stayed motionless. The only sound heard was the roar of the wind outside and the tick-tock of the grandfather clock. Occasional mumbles came through the cracks of the door, and once a muffled thump. Her ears perked, and she rose slightly, tensing her leg muscles and baring her small, razor-sharp teeth. Her heart beat faster than a rushing river, and what passed for adrenaline flowed through what resembled veins. She was ready. There was danger here to child, and she would not fail. The door burst open, shocking the guardian with its suddenness. A shadowy form stood in the shattered doorway, outlined by a shimmering light. There was a rough outline to its face, and it looked nearly human, except for the single eye glowing red in the center of what should have been a face, and the large night-black tail that whipped around behind it. Fluttering around its head, and garbed in light, was what looked almost like a bat, if bats were made of purplish-green light, and dripped a thick ichor from their wings. The two started forward, not seeing the guardian as it lay on the ground, watching them with half-lidded eyes. They were the stuff of dreams, nightmares. They were what every child feared lay beyond their closet door. The guardian rose and opened her mouth, tongue lolling to one side. She spoke in a crystalline voice, without actually using voice or breath. "I am here." The great shadowy creature froze and trained its one eye on the guardian. The fluttering light became frantic for a moment before alighting on the shadow's arms. They regarded the guardian, and though they had no face, she could sense the hostility and anger emanating from them. She spoke again. "You are not welcome here." "Madness," the light said. "We go where we wish." Its voice was glass, scratching marble. "You are not one to deny us." The shadow spoke in its gravelly rumble. "You should scamper off, little one. You are unwelcome. We are here for our prize, promised to us by the Dark Ones." They started forward. The guardian lifted her hind legs and deliberately stretched before speaking. "None shall pass. Even if my life is forfeit, you will not claim child." She opened her garnet eyes wide and hissed, lifting one paw and extending 6 razor-sharp claws. The 2 intruders paused and seemed to converse soundlessly before rushing forward. The shadow creature's eye glowed red, and liquid fire leached out in an arrow, aiming at the guardian, who was no longer there. The guardian, nerves wired, had launched herself the second the 2 started to move. She sprung straight at the light bat, swatting it from the sky with one swipe of her paw, and shrieked as searing heat lanced through her. She fell to the ground and tumbled before regaining her feet. She turned to see the light bat flying at her in a dizzying zigzag motion, specks of iridescent shards lancing from its body and carving paths in the wall and floor. One ray brushed the guardian's head, and she moaned, not taking her eyes off the oncoming enemy, despite the pain radiating from her half-severed ear. The bat screamed as it approached, beams of fire lancing in all directions. Within seconds, it was upon her. The guardian opened her mouth wide, a tearing sound at the corners of her jaw. The bat, surprised, attempted to stop its momentum, but as it slowed, the guardian leapt forward, engulfing the creature of light whole. She shuddered as she swallowed, feeling searing heat course down her gullet and set the depths of her to smoldering. She knew she had little time and whipped her head all about in search of the shadow demon. She could not find it. She frantically searched all over the smoking, dark room before heading for the stairs. Doing her best to ignore the pain rising in her, the guardian jumped several steps at a time in her haste to get to Child's room. She reached the top of the stairs and turned, skidding along the hard floor and slamming into the wall. She coughed in pain and vomited a mixture of smoke and ashes. She could feel her energy draining from her and knew her time was ending. Shoving the panic and terror down, she looked to the end of the hallway, seeing the shadow figure regard the door in front of it. She shrieked internally as the one-eyed thing looked to her, and somehow conveyed a sadistic sort of smile. She strained herself and almost flew down the hallway toward the gloating creature. It awaited her, eye glowing fire red. Just as Guardian neared, the eye exploded its energy at her. She stopped suddenly, ducking and throwing herself to the floor, skidding along, energy missing her by inches and tearing the floor to shreds. She slid into the creature's feet, bounced up, and with one paw reached back, then drove her claws into its ankle with all of her strength. The thing roared in pain and reached down with one massive black, dagger-tipped hand. She scampered up its leg, using her claws like pitons. She reached its chest and neck. She looked at the creature as it trained its eye on her. She opened her mouth, tongue wagging in satisfaction, and said, "Goodbye, you will not be missed," and made as if to cough up a hairball. The shadow creature's eye glowed red, and fire lanced out, only to be deflected and absorbed by the projectile expelled from the guardian's stomach. The light bat, coated in some kind of viscous fluid, screamed forth, emitting light in all directions. The guardian was able to discern anger and disappointment in their screams before they met. There was an explosion and a flash of red and purple light, and both the shadow and light creature disappeared. The guardian, buffeted all about, fell to the floor in a heap. She could feel, as if through a dense fog, all the cuts and burns she'd suffered, and her life draining out of her in a torrent. She closed her eyes in front of Child's room. She was tired, and Child was safe. That was enough. She was so tired. She would just rest for a short time. The night continued around her. The guardian opened his eyes and saw that Child was safely asleep. He stretched his long arms and placed his shiny brass cymbals on the ground beside him before he moved his tail about, getting a feel for it. He could sense little amiss and thought a short circuit of the house would be enough. He stood from the foot of the bed and used his tail to swing to the floor. He stopped at the threshold and regarded the door. He put his hands out, inspected them, and pushed ever so slightly, almost experimentally, and was gratified as the door swung open. He looked down on the ragged and burned stuffed animal lying on the floor, its garnet eyes closed in its feline face. The guardian walked over on his knuckles and inspected the remains. He nodded and made his way down the hallway, ready to defend what he had been made to protect.